15 intriguing facts about the U.S. involvement in World War II that Americans don't know. Fact 1. The Navajo language became the most reliable code of the war. In the Pacific Theater of Operations, American forces encountered an unexpected problem. Japanese intelligence was remarkably effective. They intercepted radio messages quickly and decrypted them just as fast. Code systems were constantly being changed, but the enemy kept adapting. Then, the Marine Corps Command received an unconventional proposal to use the language of the Navajo tribe for encryption. This language was unique, complex, with distinct grammar, no written form, and fluently spoken only by members of the tribe. Moreover, the Japanese had never encountered it. In 1942, a group of code talkers was formed from Navajo speakers. They worked in pairs. One would transmit a message, the other would receive and instantly translate it. Their code was not just confusing, it was completely indecipherable. Messages about assaults, coordinates, and movements were transmitted instantly with no risk of being intercepted. The military called this code unbreakable. Not a single one of the 411 code talkers ever failed. The language of an ancient people became the shield of a modern army. Fact 2. Over 1 million African Americans served but were not trusted with weapons. The paradox of World War II in the American experience is striking. A country that rose up to fight the fascist ideology of racial superiority still maintained deep racial segregation within its own army. African Americans, despite their desire to serve and defend their country, were largely excluded from combat units. Their role was invisible but critical. They carried ammunition, loaded supplies, built roads and airfields. They were mechanics, cooks, laborers, and drivers. They were entrusted with the hardest, dirtiest, but non-combat tasks. Military leadership questioned the reliability of black soldiers and feared internal conflicts in integrated units. Only when the front lines suffered from a shortage of trained fighters were African Americans gradually allowed into combat. That is when an elite unit emerged, the 332nd Fighter Group, known as the Tuskegee Airmen. These pilots, trained in Alabama, flew missions over Europe and protected American bombers. Throughout the war, they lost almost none of the planes they escorted, a truly exceptional achievement. After the war, President Truman signed an executive order to integrate the U.S. military, and it was thanks to these pilots that the path to equality was finally opened. Fact 3. The United States built replica Japanese cities and dropped bombs on them, before Hiroshima. Nuclear weapons are not just about science, they are also about psychological impact. Before dropping the first atomic bomb in history on a real city, American engineers and military officials wanted to know exactly what the effect would be. Somewhere in the lifeless deserts of Nevada, strange towns were built. Wooden homes, rice paper windows, traditional Japanese curtains, even dolls and household objects inside. These were exact replicas of the residential neighborhoods of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They dropped conventional, incendiary, and experimental bombs on these mock towns. Engineers studied how fire spread, how buildings burned, how rooftops collapsed. It was critical to determine the optimal altitude for the detonation to maximize destruction. After these rehearsals, the ideal detonation strategy was finalized. On August 6, 1945, precisely at 8:15 in the morning, the Little Boy bomb exploded above Hiroshima at an altitude of 600 meters, 1,968 feet. Those who made the decision already knew exactly what the outcome would be, because they had seen it happen before in the desert. Fact 4. America entered the war with the most outdated tanks of any army. On December 7, 1941, the sky over Pearl Harbor roared with the engines of Japanese aircraft, and American battleships turned into blazing wrecks. The United States officially entered World War II. However, few people at that moment realized the actual state of the army belonging to the most industrialized nation in the world. One of the most painful examples of this was the state of American armored vehicles. At that time, the main tank of the United States Army was the light M3 Stuart. Its armor was so thin that German anti-tank shells pierced through it without resistance. The armament also left much to be desired. A short-barreled 37mm cannon that could not even penetrate the side armor of the German PZ KFW-4. The real terror came when American crews faced Panther and Tiger tanks. Machines the M3 could not even approach within effective firing range. American tank crews, once under fire, were perishing by the hundreds. Their vehicles would ignite like matchsticks, and it was at this point that a grim nickname was born: Coffin on Tracks. Only by the middle of the war, with the mass production of the improved M4 Sherman tank, did the situation begin to shift. The Sherman was more comfortable, more reliable, had better armor, and a stronger gun. But even the Sherman could not match the heavy German tanks one-on-one. American forces had to rely not on superior strength, but on overwhelming numbers. For every one Tiger tank, 3 or even 5 Shermans would charge, and they would win through numbers alone. Fact 5. The largest airborne operation in history was also one of its greatest failures. In September of 1944, the Allies came up with a bold plan to end the war more quickly. The plan was daring: drop thousands of paratroopers deep behind enemy lines in the occupied Netherlands, capture key bridges over major rivers, and open a straight path to the Rhine. This operation was named Market Garden. It involved more than 35,000 American, British, and Polish paratroopers. The sight was meant to be triumphant. The sky filled with parachutes, the loud roar of Dakota transport planes, and soldiers in field uniforms racing toward their objectives. But everything began to fall apart. German forces turned out to be far stronger than Allied intelligence had estimated. Communication between units was cut, ammunition began to run out, and the bridges that were supposed to be seized were either destroyed or never taken at all. The British group near Arnhem was surrounded. The American troops near Nijmegen suffered heavy losses. The operation ended in failure. It was a personal tragedy for many soldiers and a severe blow to the reputation of Allied leadership. A swift and decisive victory was expected, but what unfolded was a bloody trap. And although the Allies eventually entered Germany, the lesson of Market Garden remains a lasting one. War does not tolerate haste or the overestimation of one's strength. Fact 6. The first American killed in Europe was the victim of British fire. War is not only about enemy fire. Sometimes the most tragic moments come from mistakes made by allies. In November of 1942, as Operation Torch began, the massive landing of American forces in North Africa, everything was supposed to be a well-coordinated joint effort. For the first time, the United States and the United Kingdom were operating side by side in the European theater. But reality turned out to be far more complicated. One American reconnaissance aircraft, a small single-engine plane with an observer on board, was carrying out a patrol mission near the Algerian coast. The American command had authorized the flight, but the information did not reach every channel. British fighter pilots, spotting an unfamiliar aircraft, assumed it was hostile and opened fire without warning. Captain Williams was killed. In some sources, the name Lawrence Cassidy is mentioned. This incident was not only tragic, it became a grim reminder of how fragile coordination can be, even among close allies, when there is no unified command structure. After this event, military communication between the United States and the United Kingdom was overhauled. Joint command centers were established, unified radio channels were put in place, and new identification procedures were introduced. But by then, the first American blood in Europe had already been spilled, and the bitter truth was that it had come from a friend's weapon. Fact 7. There were over 500 prisoner of war camps for Nazis and Japanese soldiers inside the United States. When people talk about World War II, they rarely mention that the territory of the United States itself became a part of the war, not in combat, but in humanitarian terms. From the year 1942 through 1946, more than 500 prisoner of war camps operated across the United States. Captured German, Italian, and Japanese soldiers were transported there from Africa, Europe, and the Pacific. Surprisingly, the conditions in these camps were relatively humane. The United States followed the rules of the Geneva Convention. Prisoners received medical care, 3 full meals per day, and proper clothing. They were sent to work, most often in agriculture, where farms were suffering from a shortage of labor due to mass mobilization. Farmers in Texas, Nebraska, Alabama, and other states would often recall, those German boys worked hard and honestly. What stood out most were the relationships that formed between prisoners and local residents. Despite fear and prejudice, many Americans were surprised. These soldiers were young, polite, and did not resemble the monsters shown in wartime propaganda. Friendships developed, and even romantic relationships emerged. Some prisoners, after the war ended, returned to the United States as immigrants, holding warm memories of the very camps they had once been confined in. It was one of the great paradoxes of history. Soldiers who had come as enemies quietly became part of American society. Fact 8. Hollywood fought the war on its own front in movie theaters. While the military fought with weapons, Hollywood fought with cameras. As early as 1942, the American government realized that the spirit of the nation, its confidence in victory, was formed not only on the battlefield, but also on the screen. This marked the beginning of the largest collaboration between the U.S. government and the film industry in American history. Walt Disney Studios produced dozens of animated shorts in which Donald Duck battled Nazis, avoided paying taxes, or collected scrap metal. In the cartoon Der Fuhrer's Face, Donald woke up in a Nazi nightmare and was horrified to realize how much better life was in America. That short film even won an Academy Award. Warner Bros. And MGM created documentaries and propaganda films that portrayed American soldiers as heroic, while Germany and Japan were shown as dark, threatening forces. The goal was simple: to inspire, to educate, and to mobilize. Across the country, short government-produced films were shown before movie features. These reels taught people how to behave during air raids, how to conserve gasoline, and how to avoid spreading rumors. Audiences left theaters not just as viewers, but as participants in a shared fight. Hollywood had become a powerful weapon of mass motivation. Fact 9. The Pentagon was built during the war in just 16 months. When the United States decided to enter the war, it became clear that managing such a massive scale of operations across land, sea, air, Asia, Europe, and the Pacific was impossible from scattered offices. What was needed was one giant, centralized headquarters. That is how the idea for the Pentagon was born. Construction began in September of 1941, even before the attack on Pearl Harbor. The project was ambitious, a 5-sided building with 5 ring-shaped corridors, 5 floors, and enough space to accommodate more than 20,000 employees. Work continued around the clock. More than 13,000 laborers worked at the construction site. Everything was built under pressure, with material shortages, rising wartime urgency, and demands from the government. And yet, incredibly, the Pentagon was completed in just 16 months. In January of 1943, the first employees moved in. It was a record. The largest office building in the world was built faster than any American factory. From that moment on, every operation from Normandy to Guadalcanal was coordinated from inside the Pentagon. It became the brain of America's war effort and a symbol of its organizational power. Fact 10. New York City turned off the lights at night to hide from submarines. In the spring of 1942, the people of New York City realized for the first time that the war was not happening somewhere far away. It had come frighteningly close. German submarines, known as wolf packs, appeared off the eastern coast of the United States and began a deadly hunt. Merchant ships, oil tankers, fishing vessels, they were all going down. Many Americans found it hard to believe. Could the enemy really be at our shores? But the truth soon became obvious. In the first half of 1942, German submarines sank more than 600 American ships, with dozens of those attacks happening right off the coast of New York, Florida, and even the Carolinas. In a panic, the authorities took drastic action. They dimmed the lights in the nation's major cities. For the first time in history, New York City went dark at night. Windows were covered with thick curtains. Cars drove with dimmed headlights. Store signs were switched off, and the streets emptied out. People whispered to each other. It feels like the Middle Ages again. This dark defense lasted for nearly half a year. The submarines never got any closer, but the fear remained. America had realized something. The Atlantic Ocean no longer guaranteed protection. The war was no longer an abstract idea. It was something happening right outside the window. Fact 11. The United States was already fighting Germany before the war was officially declared. The official date when the United States entered the war against Germany is December 11, 1941. But in reality, American forces were already engaged with the Germans much earlier, secretly under the cover of diplomatic caution. When war broke out in Europe in 1939, the United States officially maintained neutrality. But in practice, it was already helping Britain. American ships escorted British merchant vessels delivering weapons, food, and fuel. And then, in October of 1941, in the cold waters of the Atlantic Ocean, during a raging storm and rising radar alerts, everything changed. The destroyer USS Reuben James, which was protecting a British convoy, was struck by a torpedo from the German submarine U-552. The explosion tore through the center of the ship, which broke apart and sank. Out of 159 men on board, only 44 survived. The American public was stunned. The country had not even officially joined the war, and yet its sailors were already being lost at sea. The attack sparked outrage. People asked, "Why are our boys dying for someone else's war?" But Washington still hesitated politically. Only after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and only after Adolf Hitler himself declared war on the United States, did America respond officially. By then, however, one American warship was already lying at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, a grim signal of the larger conflict to come. Fact 12. Women became the backbone of America's defense industry. When mobilization began, millions of men left their jobs and went off to fight on the front lines. Factories, assembly lines, and workshops were left without workers. That is when the people who had never been allowed near the machines stepped up, the women. Their arrival was not just a necessity, it became the symbol of a new era. Women put on work overalls, tied back their hair, stood at welding machines, operated hydraulic presses, lifted the wings of bombers, and riveted the steel plates of tanks. The country saw the birth of a new kind of heroine, Rosie the Riveter, a woman with a strong arm and a confident gaze. Her image appeared on posters with the words, "We can do it." Thanks to millions of women, by the year 1944, the American defense industry was running at full capacity. They built thousands of airplanes, shells, tanks, and ships. They did not just support the Army, they created it. Many of them never returned to their old lives. They understood that their place was not only in the kitchen, but also in the pages of history. Fact 13. The United States built 300,000 military aircraft, an all-time record. If victory in war could be achieved through sheer numbers alone, the United States would have won with airplanes. During the years of World War II, the American aviation industry accomplished the impossible. It built more than 300,000 military aircraft. That was more than Germany, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and Japan combined. The production lines never stopped. Workers labored in 3 shifts without days off. Giant hangars in Detroit, Chicago, and Seattle echoed with the sounds of pounding presses and the whistling of rivet guns. At the Ford Willow Run plant alone, they produced 1 B-24 Liberator bomber every single hour. It was a true industrial miracle. American bombers and fighter planes filled the skies over Europe and the Pacific. They were everywhere, from Normandy to Iwo Jima. And every one of them was the result of the effort of hundreds of workers, engineers, and women on the factory floor. This was the very arsenal of democracy that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had promised. Fact 14. Many American generals had no combat experience. In the year 1941, the United States Army had a total of just over 270,000 soldiers, fewer than the Army of Portugal. Now imagine this. Within a few short years, this small army would have to grow into the most powerful fighting force in the world. But who would lead it? The problem was that most American generals had never seen real combat. Dwight D. Eisenhower, who would later become the supreme Allied commander in Europe, had never participated in a single battle before 1941. His background was in teaching, staff work, and theory, not frontline experience. The same was true for others, like Omar Bradley and George Patton. All of them had to learn how to fight a global war while already in the middle of it. Mistakes were inevitable. There were failed landings, lost convoys, and disastrous offensives. But paradoxically, that inexperience turned out to be an advantage. These young, ambitious, and unorthodox officers were not afraid of trying new ideas. They looked for unconventional solutions and learned faster than their enemies. From this, a new American school of military leadership was born, one that would later become the standard for all of NATO. Fact 15. American soldiers could not drink European coffee. At first glance, it may seem like a minor detail, but this cultural moment became a widespread phenomenon. Young American soldiers raised on weak, filtered, almost transparent coffee arrived in Europe with their thermoses and expectations, and faced a rude awakening. In France, Italy, and Belgium, coffee was thick, strong, and intensely bitter. It was real espresso. When American soldiers tried it for the first time, many grimaced, spat it out, and called it swamp sludge or burnt oil. Some even wrote home to complain, saying, "Europeans do not know how to make real coffee." Over time, that changed. Some soldiers developed a taste for the richness. In Italy, a few American-style cafes even began to open, serving something closer to what the troops were used to back home. But during the early months of the war, coffee became an unexpected front in a cultural clash. A soldier could be ready for battle, but not for a cup of strong French morning coffee. Thank you all for your support, for the likes, for subscribing to the channel, and if you have any questions or have something to say, write comments. See you in the new videos.